Well, hello again. I promised to start at the beginning, but it's too late because we have a beginning which is in our memory. I forgot one thing, or maybe a number of things. When we talked about perspectivity, that is from my perspective and so on, what happened with that notion of perspectivity is very important, perhaps very fundamental. Having arrived at the notion that everything can be a center, and that is perspective from which the universe can be understood, that center and perspectivity was later, or even at the same time, invented to be part of understanding of space. That is, space is three-dimensional. Of course, we have not seen space, just as we have not seen time. It's nothing empirical about that, but at the same time, in quotes at the same time, we invented a space which is three-dimensional, and that is known as perspectival. We see something from this perspective, and something from this perspective requires a distant point of reference. That is, at a distance, there are two triangles converging on a central line, and that perspectivity, as my perspective, is the notion that the position that I take up is a point from which the universe is seen. If I move, I will have another perspective. I think I mentioned that. And therefore, that point of perspective was associated with the notion of ego. I have a specific position, my perspective. And that means no matter where I go, I have a perspective from my specific position. If I go around a tree, I have another perspective toward the tree, and so on. So each one of us then become individual, each having its own perspective from our own position. And that language of perspectivity extended across the whole, well, not a whole galaxy, across the globe. Everyone has a perspective. And you see, initially the perspective was a spatial position. From this point, I look at a thing from that perspective. As I said, I move, I have another perspective. And that is, consciously speaking, it is a spatial consciousness, okay? And spatial consciousness requires movement. To have a perspective, I have to see that there are other perspectives from which I can see the same thing if I move. So kinesthetic consciousness enters here. We'll deal with that profoundly later on. Now, what happens in our modern history, modern philosophical history, that the perspectivity was raised to encompass everything. From scientific perspective, from biological perspective, from psychological perspective, from religious perspective, from a cultural perspective, everything acquired perspectivity, and that is that there is no deep perspective on the world. And it's fascinating. Say, well, my perspective on the world is scientific. Your perspective on the world is religious. And none can say that one is wrong and the other one is right. Why? Because the world is not a thing to which I can have a perspective. That means that every perspective is an interpretation which does not address the world, but becomes the world. My worldview, that's one variant of perspectivity. My worldview is this, and your worldview is something else. Okay? Hindus have their worldview, we have our worldview. Inca have, and Maya, they have their worldviews, many worldviews, but none of them address the world. They are simply inventions. Nowadays we call them constructs. Worldviews or world perspectives are constructs. Okay? They do not represent the world, they construct the world. As philosophers, in fact, of late are talking about the logical construction of reality. And of course, other people say the psychological construction of reality. Other people say mythological construction of reality. In short, the constitution of infinite universe that led to the requirement that there is no center, that every center is, every picked perspective, every picked point of reference can be a center. And that means from my perspective as a center, the world looks this way, from yours is something else. And that is why we have fantastic what is known as cultural wars. Okay, each culture has its own discourse. Secularists have their culture. Theologians have their culture. Scientists have their culture. Multiculturalism came from that. Okay, I just had to insert that to make sure that you understand that when we talk about contemporary situation, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was philosophically argued for. Philosophy constituted the question of infinite universe and constituted a question of perspectivity and multi-perspectivity, and therefore now we have multiple perspectives as discourses. From religious discourse as a perspective, the world is this way. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that the discourses represent the world. They are our constructs, the way we interpret it. We'll deal with the question of interpretation later on, because when people talk about interpretation, saying my interpretation, your interpretation, and so on, that is a very problematic understanding. And that is for the near future. Now, back to time awareness. And of course, we'll deal with space awareness too. And the reason we'll have to deal with that because much of time understanding uses spatial metaphors, and that is distance. Distance from here to there, 2 miles. And then we use the same term distance. Distance from now till till the past or toward the past. What is the distance? That is a spatial metaphor, and we'll have to get rid of that to understand minimally time. Now, please understand, we are just beginning to get into the question of temporal consciousness. One issue that is overlooked, and this is what we'll have to address, is that Western tradition, from Plato, Aristotle down, is known as tradition of things like substances. No matter how we slice it, everything is a thing. Remember we talked about the smallest parts, the atoms, or as scientists now call the basic building blocks of the universe. That means there are little things, but they're still things. Okay? And then the bigger things are composed of the little things. So we are the big thing, but we are a thing. In short, we have a thing mentality. Now, the issue for consciousness within this thing mentality is very severe. Remember, well, we talked about mind as atemporal, that is, not in time, because it deals with features of our awareness, such as ideas, which are not in time. So that means the rational consciousness is not in time. In fact, some people say it is eternal. Okay? Whenever you deal with ideas, you don't deal with things. But now for modern understanding, there is one fundamental issue, and that issue is what I called reductionism. Other people called it the same way, reductionism. That is, everything has to be reduced to material, biological, chemical, physiological explanation. Okay. So now, in the background, we have modern subject, which is not part of the material reality. That is a consciousness which has no features. It's empty. So once we begin to construct the material world in terms of our calculations, so to speak, technical, we also reduced ourselves to the same kind of explanation. That is, if we have chemistry, microchemistry, macrochemistry, biology, microbiology, and so on, we began to interpret ourselves in terms of those kinds of material systems. And so when we raise the question in modernity, even now, what is consciousness? We had to make the consciousness disappear. Why? Because we had to invent brain physiology where we find consciousness, okay? Where is consciousness? It's in the brain functions, okay? So our mind is a frontal lobe, our vision is in the back, in the occipital lobe, and so on. So visual consciousness is the occipital lobe in the brain, thinking is in the frontal lobe, and then we begin to perform experiments and reduce all our awareness to our physiological functions. That's fine. All the scientific research is moving in that direction. That consciousness as some kind of a subject does not exist. It can be explained by physiology, biology, chemistry, and whatever else you have, DNA, all the other disciplines. Okay, so now we are in a real position, stuck position. If you claim that all our consciousness is reducible to our physiological or physical states, then that consciousness as physical is now. If we are purely physical consciousness, that means we cannot never get out of the now point. The tree as a physical thing is now. It has no future or past. It is now. as physiological beings we are now. So what we have done is return back to the classical understanding that everything is at a now point, and everything at a now point can never get out of it. There's no past or future. Now you say, well, science can account for past and future because we have past in the brain. You know, scientists talk about we have memory traces, okay? Biological, physiological. Good. Let's agree we have memory traces, and then let's do scientific experiments. We X-ray our brain, and we find all kinds of little features, little grooves, little curves, and all of that. Where do you find among those curves that you see empirically that they are pointing to the past? They are now. And no matter how much X-raying you do, you will find more grooves, more wrinkles, and so on, and none of them say this is from the past. So you have no time. But once you say this little feature in the brain is from the past, you already included time awareness, which is not in that little brain feature. Empirically, there's nothing else. Okay? It is like saying, excuse me, that events that I experience and you experience leave footprints in our physiology, in our brain physiology, leave footprints. Now that's a metaphor, but they use that metaphor. Hobbes used it, and all empiricists use similar metaphors. That's good. So now let's look at what a footprint is. You're walking in a snowfield and you see footprints. What happened? We just surpassed empirical awareness. Purely empirically speaking, you can measure the length of it, the size of the width of it, the depth of it. That's empirical. 11 inches long, 3 inches or 4 inches apart, 1.5 inches deep. That's all you have empirically in terms of measures. Once you say it's a footprint, the question arises immediately, footprint of what? And the answer is of something that passed by. Oops, passed by, but it's no longer there. It's only a footprint. That means suddenly you give the empirical impression a meaning as signifying something that is no longer there, that has passed. But once you say it's no longer there, it's in the past, you introduce time, which that imprint in the snow has nothing to say about. In short, despite the fact, with all the efforts to reduce time awareness to physiology, to footprints in the brain, so traces, that physiology has to yield to another dimension of awareness. without which one could not say that's a footprint of something that passed by. Because what passed by is no longer at the present. But once you say it has passed by, you already introduced time awareness, which is not part of the footprint. That footprint becomes a sign of something that passed. Okay? So here you introduce time, which is not accounted by your brain physiology, brain traces. You know, the cute part about this kind of brain explanation is, well, computer has memories. All my stuff in this computer is in there, and it remembers. The computer doesn't remember a darn thing. It has its algorithms, which are, remember, mathematical and not in time. And the features, the empirical features of computer, the screens and all of that, as empirical, have no memory. The prints in the computer, the files, you can read them. They have no memory. So when we say computers, the memory, such memory of a computer, you know, so many gigabytes and all of that, the computer doesn't have memory. We add to it. Say, well, that file I wrote 5 years ago. That 5 years ago is not in the computer. It is consciousness, which is not my physiological consciousness. I mean, the physiology has no consciousness, okay? Okay, so now we constantly appeal to a dimension of awareness, which is not empirical, which is not physiological, not in my brain. You know, there's another fascinating feature in current research. They say that numbers, for example, we talked about ideas, mathematics. We talked with Plato about ideas, what are ideas of justice or truth or democracy or whatever. That those ideas are repeatable. In short, they have no time. So now, and Plato talked about mathematical ideas, Pythagorean theorem. So now the question arises, where is this Pythagorean theorem? Okay, where is it? That's immediate. Spatial question. And of course, to be empirical, to have empirical consciousness, you have to find this idea, mathematical idea, somewhere. And so we perform experiments. Empirical. And we're looking for that idea in the brain. X-ray and all of that, talk to people, and we can't find it. And yet we say, I see 2 + 2 is 4. I have direct seeing. Every scientist would say, obviously 2 + 2 is 4. Can't you see yourself? Okay, so where is it? Nowhere. And yet we see. Now, when we say we see 2 + 2 is 4, what we know of it is that we write it down, like 2 + 2 is 4, simple, 2 + 2 is 4. That's empirical. But when I say in English 2 + 2 is 4, that's a sound. That's a very different empirical phenomenon. I can say it in German. I speak many languages. And we'll still be talking about the same number, the same formula, despite the great empirical variations. We talk about the same thing, which is not empirical. What I'm prying us from is that modern empirical, material, biological, chemical explanation of our awareness. Our awareness of 2 plus 2 is 4 is nowhere to be found. It has no space or time position. In short, when I form perspectives to walk around a tree, I have to walk around to see the other side of a tree. That's physiological consciousness, movement consciousness. And we'll deal with that in broader terms. Now, when I'm dealing with 2 plus 2 equals 4, I have no way to talk about perspectivity. How does 2 plus 2 equals 4 from another perspective? Can I walk around it to see it from the other side? No. No matter where, when I announce the same formula, I don't form a perspective towards it. Because if I form a perspective, that means from another perspective, it would look something different. But it does not. I don't have to walk around 2 plus 2 equals 4 to form perspectives. So here, the perspectival space that we invented is no longer relevant for that level of consciousness. Okay. Now, what is interesting and essential for us, if I say 2 plus 2 is 4 in English, I write it down in Chinese, I discuss it with my friend Plato 2,400 years ago, I'm talking about the same thing, different imagery, but talking about the same thing. Now, what does this have to do with time awareness? Well, when we say, like physiologists would say, we have a memory trace. Now that memory trace is now. But once we say it is a trace of something that has passed by, okay, that memory trace becomes a sign towards something else. When I say, or when we say, anyone says, I remember my friend. Okay, what do we have? I have an image of Joe, good friend. Okay, the image of Joe is not just an image, so to speak, a trace in my physiology, but an image which points to something else that is no longer there. Joe, I saw Joe 2 months ago. So the image, if we say we're looking for images in the brain, the images become images of something. That means they point to something beyond themselves. And to point to something beyond themselves means that something which is no longer there, and that means the gap between my image right now and what is no longer there is temporal gap, which is not an image. And it's not an image of Joe, whom I saw 2 months ago. I mean, the image is of Joe, but Joe that I saw 2 months ago is no longer present. So here we have introducing constantly something that is not an image, that is not what has passed, time awareness, no matter what. Okay? Now, Kant, one of the great philosophers of modern age and of enlightenment, in fact, raised the same questions I'm raising. And he said, of course, that since time is not part of any kind of objects or images, then time is a condition, what he called a priori condition of all awareness, of all understanding before any kind of things. He called it a priori, or prior to, or at the base of any kind of experience of anything. In short, he said, time is awareness of things one after the other. Things pass by one after the other, but one after the other is not a feature or a characteristic of anything. Things pass one after the other, but one after the other is time awareness, time consciousness. Okay? And in fact, he said, space is things one next to the other. Okay? That too is required composition to talk about things, one next to the other. Next to the other is not a thing, not a feature of anything. It's a spatial awareness. But now let's return back to time awareness as one thing after another. That's nice. But remember, Socrates would say, this is a very nice answer, but something is amiss. So now we have to back up a little and remember, I mentioned one peculiar thing about Western understanding of the world as thing-like. Things, particles, parts, building blocks of the universe, some of parts like human beings, some of atoms, and so on. Things. So, what does it have to do with time understanding? Well, it has a lot to do when we say, well, things one after the other. Things pass into the past. They are no more. They are no longer. We expect things to come. They are not yet. And so that means future is not yet, because the thing hasn't showed up. What we have conflated is thing awareness with time awareness. Since the thing that has passed is no longer, it means the past is no longer. Remember, I mentioned one of the saints, Saint Augustine, who talked that way. He said, everything that is at present. But the things at present pass away. They are no longer. They have been annihilated. Time annihilates everything. Future is not yet. It's coming. Things will come from the future, therefore we have future. And the things that come from the future, they pass me by, so to speak, and they disappear into the past. And since things are no longer, past is no longer. And that is why we invented memory. What happened to the things that have passed? Well, they are in the memory. Okay? We remember them. But they are no longer in reality, just as past is no longer in reality. So past is in memory, and future is in expectation. Okay? So here you have, and St. Augustine said, past in memory and future in expectation. That means time is in the soul. We are at present. The soul is expanding our awareness towards past and future, since both are no longer, one is no longer and the other one is not yet. So where is time? Is in the soul. Okay? And so now we reduce the soul to brain physiology, and we're looking for time in the brain traces, in the brain footprints, and so on. We have not gone beyond St. Augustine, except his soul now became brain physiology. Okay. So here we are, hung up on that brain physiology, which constantly loses its power once it introduces time awareness. And that time awareness is not brain physiology. Okay. So all our explanations fail, because in principle they assume time awareness, which is nowhere to be found. Not in the soul and not in the brain. So what opens up in principle is what Whitehead, one of the great philosophers of 20th century, asked, how is it that with all our explanations we are hanging ourselves on the now point, whether materially or psychologically? The now point is inescapable. And why did ask, how do we get off this now point? Okay. And you speak with profound astronomers and all of that, said, well, from the point, from this point in time, it's always the point in time, we can calculate. Now, the beauty part of it, or the beautiful question is, we calculate from the now, from this point in time. How can that be? If everything changes in time, then the point changes. So by the time you finish calculating, the points have changed. It's too late, so to speak. By the time I finish calculating, say, excuse me, the time points have changed. Here again, we're in a quandary. If we talk about calculating time, from point in time to next point in time, can we repeat that calculation if everything is temporal? As Buddha said, we'll deal with, by the way, with other parts of the world, with other traditions and their time awareness, which might be quite distinct and different from ours. And in fact, some people think that India thinks cosmically, not in terms of things. See, like I mentioned, we have thing mentality. But that mentality is in fact what covers over our time awareness. And that means since the past thing is no longer, that means past is no longer. Why? Why should past be gone just because Joe is no longer present to me? He passed by me 2 months ago. Is Joe no longer? Just because he passed by me, one after the other. Joe passed by, the truck passed by, a group of people passed by, the meteorite passed by. All of a sudden, all the things pass by, that means past is no longer. That is the conflation of thing mentality with time awareness. And so we have to now unglue ourselves from thing mentality, including brain physiology, and including Kant's time awareness as one after the other. Because once you have that, then past is no longer, things have passed, past is no more. Then you're back in the same quandary, well, past is in the memory. But that's inadequate. So I shall leave you with this quandary. How shall we get out of the now point and find time awareness which does not belong on any thing mentality, not even in terms of spatial measure, distances? So till then, I thank you for your attention.